The millionaire's daughter never walked, until he saw the maid doing something unbelievable. Billionaire widower Richard Hale woke up to another day without remembering the last time he had slept through the night. It was barely dawn, 5 o'clock, and the mansion by the sea stood as silent as a tomb. He rose from the king-sized bed, far too big for one man, and walked into the bathroom without turning on the light. He knew every inch of the house, yet somehow he always felt lost within it. It had been 3 years since the accident. 3 years since Emily, the love of his life, had died. 3 years since Sophie, their only daughter, had been confined to a wheelchair. Richard tried not to think about it, but memories clung to him like shadows. That rainy night, he had been the one driving. They had argued about something trivial he could no longer remember, and then a truck came out of nowhere. The sound of the crash, the shattering glass, the smell of smoke, and Sophie's faint cry. They still haunted his dreams. Every morning was the same. Richard dressed in one of his dark suits, all identical, all soulless, and descended the marble staircase. Once upon a time, Sophie used to run barefoot down those very steps, and Emily would laugh, calling after her, "Careful, sweetheart." Now those stairs were nothing but a wall between two worlds, his and his daughter's. In the kitchen, Margaret, the housekeeper of over 20 years, was preparing coffee. She had witnessed Sophie's birth, the family's happiness, and the moment it all collapsed. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," she greeted softly, her voice heavy with quiet worry. "Morning," Richard muttered without looking up, pouring himself a cup of black coffee. "Miss Sophie didn't eat again last night," Margaret said carefully. "I know," he replied coldly. "If she doesn't want to eat, let her be." "But sir, she needs—" "Do your job, Margaret." She said nothing, only watched him leave with his coffee still steaming. Behind that icy shell, she knew, was a man quietly breaking apart. Richard left the house at 6, as he always did, never going upstairs to see his daughter. He never could. Work consumed him. It was easier that way. At Hale Biotech, he buried himself in meetings, approvals, strategies. His employees respected him, but feared him. They called him the Ice Wall. By evening, the city lights shimmered outside his office. He often stared through the glass, watching the snow fall, wondering what Sophie was doing, whether she'd eaten, then forcing himself back to the numbers on his desk. When he returned home past midnight, the mansion slept. Margaret left food on the table, but he only ate a few bites. He always avoided the hallway that led to Sophie's room. Even the sound of her wheelchair rolling made his chest tighten painfully. Meanwhile, upstairs, Sophie sat by the window, staring at a world that had moved on without her. She watched neighborhood kids laughing in the snow, birds gliding freely through the sky. Everything alive, except her. "Where's Dad, Margaret?" she asked one night, her voice trembling. "He's working, dear. He's very busy. He hates me because I didn't die with Mom." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Don't say that, Sophie. Your father loves you very much." But Sophie turned away, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. The house stood still, wrapped in the sound of the wind howling from the sea. And somewhere in that heavy quiet, fate was already moving, preparing to bring a stranger into their lives, a woman who would change everything. That morning, a thick mist hung over the coast, and the light outside looked like it hadn't fully woken. In the vast, echoing kitchen, Margaret sighed as she looked at the endless list of chores. The last housekeeper had quit, and Richard wanted no talk of hiring anyone new. But she couldn't do it all anymore. Sophie needed someone around. When the knock came at the back door, Margaret didn't know it would change everything. A small woman stood outside, clutching a worn canvas bag. Her brown hair was tied back, her eyes tired but bright. "I heard you might need some help," she said softly. "I can clean, cook, wash, whatever you need." Her name was Maria Torres, 34, a widow, a mother. There was something honest about her. The way she stood, the way her hands looked rough but steady. "Have you worked in homes before?" Margaret asked. "Yes, ma'am. I clean at a hotel at night and can come here in the mornings. I just want to earn enough for my boy." Margaret didn't hesitate. "Can you start today?" Maria smiled, relief flickering across her face. The mansion was silent, almost eerily so. Every step she took echoed through empty rooms. As she worked her way upstairs, a sound made her stop. Soft, muffled sobs coming from a half-open door. She hesitated, then knocked gently. "You okay in there?" No answer. Just a shaky voice, small and angry. "Go away, I don't need anyone." Maria waited, then said quietly, "That's fine. I'll just clean out here. You won't even notice me." Inside, Sophie sat in her wheelchair, hair tangled, cheeks blotchy from crying. "You're just like the others," she muttered. "You'll pity me, then leave." Maria didn't answer. She bent down, picked up a pencil that had rolled across the floor, and placed it back on the desk. A sketchbook lay open there, filled with half-finished drawings. "You draw?" she asked softly. "I used to," Sophie said flatly. "Why'd you stop?" "It doesn't matter. My mom used to draw with me. She's gone now." Maria was quiet for a long moment. "I lost someone too," she said finally. "For a while I thought I'd never want to do anything I loved again. But then I realized sometimes we draw, not to forget the pain, but to give it a shape." Sophie's eyes lifted, curious despite herself. Maria reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn pencil. "Try one line," she said gently. "No one has to see it." For a long while, Sophie didn't move. Then, slowly, she took the pencil. The first line trembled, but then another followed, and another. Maria sat on the floor beside her, silent, smiling softly. "Are you watching me?" Sophie asked in a whisper. "No," Maria said. "I'm listening to your drawing." The room grew quiet, but it was no longer the heavy silence of grief. It was softer, alive. When Sophie finished, she looked at the paper, then at Maria, and something broke loose inside her. She laughed. Just once, barely a sound, but a real, living laugh. That night, Margaret saw something she hadn't seen in years. Sophie by the window, smiling under the moonlight, her sketchbook open on her lap. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She knew then that the stranger who had walked into their home wasn't just there to clean. She was there to bring the house, and its hearts, back to life. It was Saturday morning, and the wind from the sea carried the faint scent of salt through the open windows. Richard had come home earlier than usual. Something felt different the moment he stepped inside. The air, the light, the silence. It wasn't the same heavy stillness he had grown used to. Then he heard it, a sound so fragile, so unexpected that he froze. Laughter. At first he thought he imagined it, but as he stood at the foot of the stairs, the sound came again. Clear, bright, unmistakable. It was Sophie's laughter. His heart clenched. For 3 long years, that sound had been missing from his world. Carefully, almost fearfully, he climbed the stairs, following the sound like a man chasing a memory. Through the half-open door, He saw Maria sitting cross-legged on the floor beside Sophie. Sheets of paper and colored pencils were scattered everywhere. Maria was telling a story, her voice warm and rhythmic, like a lullaby. And so, the little cat decided it wasn't afraid anymore. It drew wings for itself and flew. Sophie giggled. "Cats don't have wings." "Maybe not in real life," Maria said, smiling. "But in your drawings, anything is possible, isn't it?" Their laughter mingled, soft and free. It spilled into the hallway, seeping through the cracks in the walls Richard had built around himself. He leaned against the wall, unable to move. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard that sound. Probably before the accident, before everything broke. His throat tightened. He wanted to step inside, to say something, anything. But guilt pinned him where he stood. He watched, silent as Maria began to hum a tune. Something Spanish, low and tender. Sophie joined in, her voice fragile but full of effort. When the song ended, she laughed again, truly laughed, and it hit Richard like sunlight after a long storm. That night, over dinner, he asked, "How long has that new woman, Maria, been working here?" Margaret looked up, surprised. "About a week, sir." "And she spends a lot of time with Sophie?" "Not that much, but she's different. She makes the child talk, eat, even try her therapy again." Richard nodded, his expression unreadable. "What does she say about herself?" "Almost nothing. She's quiet, kind, very genuine." That word, genuine, stuck with him. It didn't fit the world he knew. No one ever came close without wanting something. No one was kind without a reason. He couldn't sleep that night. The image of Maria and Sophie laughing kept replaying in his mind. The house had been dark for so long, and now, suddenly, there was light again. But along with that light came unease. Why did this stranger care so deeply about his daughter? Was it pure kindness, or something else entirely? The next morning, sitting in his office, Richard picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "I need you to look into someone for me," he said evenly. "Maria Torres. Find out everything you can." On the other end, the detective asked, "What did she do?" Richard looked out the window, where the pale sunlight reflected on the glass. "Nothing," he said quietly. "And maybe that's what worries me." He hung up, but Sophie's laughter still echoed in his mind. That miraculous sound that had awakened a heart he thought long dead. And along with it, deep inside, a quiet seed of doubt began to grow. Richard didn't yet know it, but from that day on, neither his heart nor Maria's fate would ever be the same again. 4 days later, as morning light streamed through the glass walls of his office, Richard looked up to see his private investigator step in. Ben Carter, a man he'd trusted for years, carried a thick folder in his hands. His voice was quieter than usual. "I brought the information you asked for," Ben said, setting the file on the desk. Richard didn't speak. He opened the first page, eyes sharp and detached as always. But the further he read, the more that cold focus began to crumble. Each line felt like a quiet blow to the chest. Maria Torres, age 34, widow, single mother. Works 3 jobs, night shift at a laundromat, mornings as a cleaner in your home, afternoons at a small Latin grocery. Sleeps about 3 to 4 hours a day. No savings. Every dollar goes to her son's education. Ben continued. Lately, she's been buying art supplies, sketch pads, paints, pencils, all paid in cash, from a store near your neighborhood. The owner says she mentioned they were for a special little girl she takes care of. Richard's eyes lifted slowly. For Sophie? Yes, sir. For Sophie. The silence that followed was heavy. He stared at the file again, at the handwritten notes, the receipts, the pictures. They weren't just data. They were proof of something raw and human. He, a man who had everything, wealth, power, the best doctors, hadn't been able to give his daughter the one thing she needed: joy. And the woman he had doubted, the one he'd looked down on, had given it freely, out of nothing but kindness. She bought the supplies, with her own money, he murmured. Ben nodded. She never asked for a raise, never took a gift. She's just genuine, sir. Richard leaned back, eyes closing. Shame burned in his chest. For years, he'd built walls to keep people from taking advantage of him. But those same walls had kept love out. Maria hadn't asked for anything. She'd simply seen a child who'd forgotten how to laugh, and gave her a reason to. His gaze fell to the framed photo on his desk. Sophie smiling, back when Emily was still alive. The memory twisted inside him. For the first time, he saw himself not as a victim of tragedy, but as a coward hiding behind his success. He pressed his palms to his face. Alone in that bright office, Richard Hale cried. The first tears in 3 long years. Not for what he'd lost, but for what he'd become. Ben, he said finally, voice low and cracked. Thank you. Tell no one about this. Ben nodded and left quietly, closing the door behind him. Richard sat there for a long time, staring out over the city, at people rushing through their lives, fighting to survive. Somewhere among them, Maria was probably scrubbing floors, folding laundry, trying to stay awake. He felt suddenly small, humbled. He reached for his phone, then stopped. He didn't know what to say. Not yet. But one thing was clear. He would not keep running. Not from his guilt, not from his daughter, not from the light that woman had brought back into his house. For the first time in years, Richard left the office early. Not to escape, but to begin again, with a smile, a pencil, and the quiet grace of a stranger's kindness. When Richard left the office that evening, the sun was sinking behind the skyline. The light spilled across the streets like soft gold, and for the first time in years, something inside him felt calm. The shame still lingered, but it was mixed now with gratitude and a strange, quiet hope. On the drive home, he didn't think about meetings or reports. He thought about his daughter's smile and the woman who had brought it back. As he stepped through the front door, he heard the faint sound of pencils scratching upstairs. He followed it, slowly, until he reached Sophie's room. The door was half open. Inside, Maria sat beside Sophie, both of them hunched over a mess of papers and colored pencils. The sunset filtered through the curtains, bathing the room in warm amber light. Sophie giggled at something Maria said, her face soft and alive again. Richard stood there for a long time, afraid to break the spell. But this time, instead of retreating, he knocked gently. Both of them turned. Sophie tensed for a moment, but didn't look away. Maria smiled. I think she's made a lot of progress today, sir. Progress? Richard asked quietly. She's learning to draw her happy memories, Maria said softly. Maybe you should too. Her words struck something deep in him. After a pause, he walked in and sat down beside them. Sophie hesitated, then offered him a pencil. What do you want me to draw? He asked. She looked down, whispering, Mom. The room went still. Richard's hand trembled as he picked up the pencil. It had been 3 years since he'd held one. Slowly he began to draw, each line deliberate, fragile. Bit by bit, Emily's face emerged. Her smile, her hair, her gentle eyes. Sophie watched, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I miss her," she said. Richard set the pencil down, his voice breaking. "I miss her too. That night, I was driving. We argued. If I just—" "It was my fault," Sophie interrupted, her voice shaking. "I screamed. I made her—" "No, sweetheart." He turned, taking her hands in his. "It wasn't your fault. Not then, not ever. I've carried the guilt for years, but the truth is, I was the one who couldn't face it. I thought avoiding you would make it easier, but it only made us both suffer." Sophie's face crumpled. Then the sobs came, deep, uncontrollable. Richard pulled her into his arms. She clung to him, crying into his chest, and he held her tight, crying too. It wasn't graceful or quiet. It was raw and broken and real, the sound of two hearts finding their way back to each other after being lost for too long. Outside the door, Maria pressed a hand to her mouth, her own eyes glistening. The sunlight caught her tears, turning them to gold. She smiled through them, the smile of someone who had just witnessed a small miracle. That night, the mansion felt different. The air wasn't heavy anymore. At dinner, father and daughter sat together, with Maria across the table quietly watching. They didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. Every glance, every small smile was a brick laid in the bridge they were rebuilding. In the days that followed, mornings began with shared breakfasts. Richard helped with Sophie's therapy, awkward at first, but patient, determined. Maria guided gently, offering a hand, a word, a laugh when needed. She was no longer just the housekeeper. She had become the bridge between a father and his daughter, between grief and grace, between what was broken and what could still be whole again. Since that night, Richard's house had felt alive again. Light, laughter, and the smell of warm meals drifting through the halls. Sophie worked hard at her therapy every day, and Richard, awkward but devoted, stayed by her side. Maria kept working quietly, never asking for anything in return. But peace rarely lasts. One morning, as Richard reviewed reports at the office, his secretary announced, "Ms. Victoria Hale is here to see you." He froze for a second. His sister rarely visited unless it was important or unpleasant. Victoria walked in, sharp as ever, tall heels, tailored coat, and eyes that cut through people like glass. She had always been brilliant, ambitious, and bitter. "You look better," she said with a faint smirk. "I hear your house has laughter again?" Richard studied her warily. "Yes, Sophie's doing better." "How wonderful," she said, her tone laced with irony. "I assume it has something to do with that new housekeeper of yours?" Richard didn't answer. Victoria leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Richard, you've always been too trusting. That woman, Maria, right? What do you really know about her? She's kind. She's helped Sophie heal. Or maybe," Victoria said coolly, "she just knows exactly how to make you feel that way." "Enough," Richard muttered, standing, but she wasn't finished. "I'm trying to protect you," she pressed. "No one does something for nothing. Not with you. You're Richard Hale, a name worth millions. All she has to do is play the part of a saint." He exhaled sharply, ready to end the conversation, until she slid a folder across the table. "If you won't take my word, take a look at this." Inside were bank statements, receipts, and transfers, all in Maria's name. Some showed money drawn from Hale Biotech's accounts. "What the hell is this?" he asked, his voice dropping. "She's been skimming small amounts from the company payroll. Nothing large, just enough to slip past the accountants. But I noticed things." He stared at the papers, heart pounding. Logic fought emotion. He wanted to believe Maria, but his sister's words burrowed deep. Could it all have been a lie? "I'll look into it," he said finally. "You should," Victoria replied coldly. "Don't be fooled by a sweet face. You've gone soft." The next day, Richard called Maria into his study. She came in smiling, unaware. He didn't return the smile. "Can you explain this?" He pushed the folder toward her. Maria frowned, confused. I don't understand. These transfers are under your name." "That's impossible. I never—" "Don't lie to me." His voice cut through the air, sharp with anger and pain. "I trusted you." Maria's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't take anything. I swear it. The evidence says otherwise." She stood frozen. "You really think I'd do this? You think I was here for money? You think I'd ever hurt Sophie?" Richard couldn't look at her. "You don't have to come back here. Not until I know the truth." Her voice trembled. "I thought I'd found a home here. But I guess poor people don't get the benefit of trust." She turned and walked away, quietly, with the dignity of someone whose heart had just been broken. When the door slammed shut, Sophie's voice rang out from the stairs, high and desperate. "Dad! She's innocent! She didn't do anything!" Richard didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at the papers in his hand, feeling the old walls of doubt rise again, crushing the fragile bridge they had just begun to build. 2 days passed. The Hale mansion had gone quiet again. No laughter, no singing, no scent of fresh bread. Sophie shut herself in her room, refusing to speak. Richard drowned in guilt and confusion, unable to face the silence he'd created. That evening, as he sat in his study, Margaret walked in with a tray of tea. She hesitated before speaking. "Sir, I know you may not want to hear this, but I must say it." Richard didn't look up. "Go on." "Maria didn't do it," he sighed. "Margaret, I saw the evidence." "Evidence can lie," she said firmly. "I've worked for this family 20 years. I know hearts better than papers. That woman is honest, sir. Please check again." Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes did not. Richard stared at her, conflicted. Maria's tearful face haunted him every night. "You hired a detective once," Margaret pressed gently. "Hire him again. Let the truth speak for itself." Richard finally nodded. 3 days later, Ben Carter returned with a new file. His expression was grave. "You'll want to see this." Inside were photos, transaction logs, and digital reports. And the name signed under every false transfer wasn't Maria Torres. It was Victoria Hale. "She's in serious debt," Ben explained. "Over $200,000. She's been using company credentials to move small amounts of money, then blaming Maria. My guess, she planned to take control of the company if your reputation took a hit." Richard went still. "Dear God, my own sister." Ben nodded. "The bank confirmed the forged signatures. The access logs point directly to her account." For a moment, Richard couldn't breathe. Anger, shame, and disbelief collided inside him. He'd accused the wrong person, the only person who had shown him kindness. That evening, he stormed into Victoria's office. She looked up, calm and calculating as ever. "Richard, what a surprise." He dropped the folder on her desk. "You're in debt. 200,000. Want to explain?" Her smile faltered. "You're imagining things." "No," he said, his voice steady but trembling with rage. "You forged transfers, framed an innocent woman, and tried to destroy my family. I won't let you ruin another life." "Richard, listen. Enough. You're done. You're out of the company, out of my life. My lawyers will handle the rest." He turned and left before she could speak. That night, Richard drove to the industrial district, where the night shift janitors worked. The air reeked of bleach. Down a long corridor, he spotted her. Maria, on her knees scrubbing the floor, her hair tied back, her uniform soaked with sweat. "Maria," he said softly. She froze, then turned. "What are you doing here?" He stepped closer. "I was wrong. It was Victoria. She framed you. I came to say, I'm sorry." Her eyes glistened. "Do you have any idea what I lost, Richard? My job, my dignity, the small bit of trust I dared to have in you." "I know," he said quietly, "and I don't deserve your forgiveness. I just wanted you to know the truth." For a long moment, only the hum of the cleaning machine filled the space. Then Maria spoke, her voice steady and calm. "You want me to come back?" "Yes," he said. "Not as a maid, as part of our lives." She met his eyes, unwavering. "Then remember this, Richard Hale. Trust me, or lose me forever." He nodded, his throat tight. "I will." Under the pale, fluorescent light, something inside both of them shifted. The beginning of forgiveness, fragile but real, and the faint rebirth of trust between two hearts that had once been strangers. A week later, Maria returned to the Hale house, not with a mop and bucket, but with a sketchbook and a box of watercolors in her hands. Richard had prepared a small room for her beside the library, where morning light poured through wide windows. When the door opened, Sophie squealed with joy, tears spilling as she smiled. She wheeled herself toward Maria and threw her arms around her. "I knew you'd come back." Maria laughed, brushing the girl's hair. "I promised, didn't I?" From that day on, Maria was no longer a maid. She became Sophie's tutor and companion. Each morning, they painted flowers in the garden or watched the waves crash against the rocks. In the afternoons, Maria helped Sophie read, study math, and express her emotions through color. Sophie was quick, creative, and full of life, her laughter filling every corner of the house. Sometimes, Richard would pause during work calls just to glance out the window and watch them laugh together in the sunlight. Occasionally, he'd step outside, sit with them, and listen to Sophie's stories while Maria quietly sketched. Maria had quit her other two jobs. With the stable salary Richard insisted on, not as charity, but recognition, she no longer had to work through the night. She spent more time with Leo, her teenage son. One evening, Richard invited them both to dinner. The dining room, once set for two, now had 4 places. "Your son seems bright," Richard said. "Leo's a good boy," Maria smiled. "He loves machines. Says he wants to be an engineer." Richard nodded. "I might be able to help. A friend of mine teaches at a technical academy. I'll ask about a scholarship." Maria froze, overwhelmed. "You don't have to. It's not for you," he interrupted gently, smiling. "It's because he deserves it." Leo looked down, shy but grateful. Sophie clapped her hands. "That's awesome. You'll study nearby, right?" "Maybe," Leo laughed. "As long as you don't make me color every day." The room erupted in laughter, a sound that felt like music after years of silence. In the months that followed, the Hale mansion changed rhythm completely. Mornings began with shared breakfasts. Afternoons meant therapy, lessons, and walks through the garden. Evenings were spent watching movies, playing chess, or sketching together under soft, golden light. The bond between Richard and Maria grew slowly, naturally, quietly. There were no grand gestures, no declarations, only glances that lingered a little longer, a cup of tea waiting at his desk, a soft laugh shared over something simple. One night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Richard passed the living room and saw Maria at her easel, painting. He stopped, watching her brush gentle strokes of color onto a canvas, Sophie's smile framed by lavender blooms. "That's beautiful," he said quietly. Maria smiled without turning. "I just paint the things that remind me the world can still be kind." He hesitated. "I think you're one of those things, Maria." She finally looked up, her eyes soft and warm, no longer between employer and employee, but two souls learning to trust again. And from that night on, something shifted. The light in the Hale house seemed brighter. The laughter lingered longer. And within those walls, warmth returned. The quiet, healing warmth of a family being made whole again. The months that followed passed in a peace Richard never thought he'd know again. The house was filled with light and laughter. Each morning, he, Maria, and the two children shared breakfast beneath the bougainvillea vines, sunlight trickling through the leaves like gold dust. Love between Richard and Maria didn't arrive with declarations. It grew quietly, through glances held a little longer, shared smiles over morning tea, and the simple warmth of two hands brushing and not pulling away. One summer evening, Richard stood by the window, watching Maria teach Sophie how to paint the sky while Leo teased her about her brushstrokes. The sight made his chest tighten, not from pain, but from gratitude. For the first time in years, he saw what he had longed for, a real family. That night, he invited them all to the garden. Tiny lights hung above the table, twinkling like stars among lavender blooms. The air was sweet with scent and anticipation. Maria stepped out in a simple cream dress, her hair loose and soft. "Maria, you look beautiful," Sophie exclaimed. Maria laughed. "You only say that because you picked the dress." When dinner was nearly done, Richard stood. His voice was low but steady, his eyes fixed on the woman beside his daughter. "Maria," he began, 3 years ago, I lost faith in people, in love, in myself. And then you came. You didn't just make Sophie laugh again. You made me remember how to live. You brought light not just to this house, but to my heart." Maria looked up, her eyes shining in the candlelight. Richard knelt, pulling a small silver ring from his pocket, engraved with a tiny lavender flower. "I can't promise an easy life," he said softly, "but I can promise to love you, protect you, and trust you for as long as I breathe." For a moment, the world went still. Then Maria pressed a trembling hand to her chest, tears glimmering. "Yes, Richard," she whispered. "I will." Sophie squealed with joy, throwing her arms around them both. Leo grinned, awkward and happy. "Congrats, Dad." Richard blinked, surprised, then smiled wider than he had in years. "Thank you, son." A few weeks later, their wedding took place in the same garden. No grandeur, no crowd, just 4 hearts and a handful of close friends. Sophie was the flower girl. Leo stood proudly by Richard's side. They lit white candles together, their faces glowing in the warm light. When Richard slid the ring onto Maria's finger, Sophie whispered, "Mom, you look so pretty." Maria turned, smiling through tears. "So do you, my little angel." Music played softly. They danced under the stars, surrounded by candles and laughter, the night alive with love. The Hale house, once a place of sorrow, now pulsed with life. In that golden glow, with laughter, hope, and the quiet hum of hearts finally at peace, love was reborn. Years passed since that small wedding beneath the lavender lights. Time softened old wounds, yet made every joy shine brighter. The Hale house, once silent and cold, now pulsed with laughter, music, and the sweet scent of fresh bread each morning. Maria gave birth to a baby girl the following spring. They named her Grace, the gift of life. Holding her tiny daughter, Maria whispered, "Every pain we once carried led us here." Richard smiled, kissed her forehead, and murmured, "Thank you for teaching me how to love again." Sophie, now 17, could walk on her own after years of therapy. Steady, proud, radiant. Her passion for art had become her calling. She opened her first exhibition, titled Healing Through Color. Her paintings glowed with hope, each brushstroke a story of survival. When asked about her inspiration, she simply smiled and said, "From the people who never gave up on me." Leo had grown into a confident young man. He graduated top of his class in engineering and returned to work with Richard on a regenerative medicine project, technology that could heal damaged nerves. "It's my way of giving back," Leo said, grinning. Richard only rested a hand on his shoulder, eyes filled with pride. The mansion, once empty, was now alive with paintings, photographs, and the soft piano notes Sophie played while Grace sang along. Every evening, they gathered at the same table to share stories and laughter, while Maria baked something warm and sweet. The past was no longer a wound. It was the reason they understood love so deeply. One sunset, Richard and Maria sat together on the porch, hands intertwined, watching the children play in the garden. The golden light touched Grace's hair as Sophie showed her how to paint, and Leo fixed a string of lights above them. Richard's voice broke the silence, low and thoughtful. "You ever think about how some miracles don't come from the sky?" Maria turned to him, smiling. "What do you mean?" He looked at her, eyes shining with quiet gratitude. "Sometimes," Richard whispered, "miracles don't fall from heaven. They walk into your house, holding a mop and a heart full of light." Maria laughed softly, tears glimmering in the sunset. And there, on the porch bathed in gold, surrounded by laughter and lavender, the painting of tomorrow was finally complete, not drawn in color, but in love.